The boarding process had been long and exhausting, the kind of shuffle through narrow aisles and crowded rows that could wear down even the most patient traveler. For Rachel Torres, it was just another reminder that the world outside the military moved differently, slower, more chaotic, less disciplined. She had endured deployments that stretched across deserts and oceans, but there was something about the jostling elbows, the impatient sighs, and the endless overhead bin drama that made her feel oddly vulnerable. Still, she carried herself with quiet composure as she found her seat number glowing on the small panel above the first-class row. It was a small mercy, the airline clerk's last-minute upgrade, and she had accepted it with a tired smile. Rachel lowered herself into the wide leather seat carefully, her body stiff from old injuries that never quite healed. Beneath her jeans, scars ran jagged across her knees. Her right shoulder, once shattered by shrapnel, still protested each time she lifted her carry-on. And yet, none of these outward reminders carried the same weight as what she felt inside the ghosts of missions past, the faces of teammates she would never see again. They were stitched into her silence, pressed into every moment she tried to live like an ordinary passenger. She placed her bag at her feet and adjusted the seatbelt across her lap. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and coffee, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to relax. A homecoming wasn't just about geography. It was about permission to breathe, to let the walls come down. She was almost there. But not everyone saw her as she was. To the flight attendant making her way down the aisle, Rachel was just another traveler in worn jeans, a simple t-shirt, and hair pulled back into a low, no-nonsense bun. There was nothing glamorous about her, nothing polished or businesslike, no hint of wealth or status. She didn't fit the profile the attendant had grown used to seeing in first class. The attendant paused beside Rachel's seat, her brows lifting slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but edged with doubt. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers." Rachel looked up, surprised. "Yes, I know. This is my seat." The attendant's eyes flicked toward the boarding pass in Rachel's hand, as though silently challenging her claim. "May I see that, please?" Without protest, Rachel offered it over. The woman scanned the ticket, her lips pressing into a thin line. She handed it back with a faint sigh, unwilling to concede, but unwilling to argue with printed proof. Still, she wasn't done. "You may want to double-check with the gate," the attendant continued, her voice loud enough to carry to nearby rows. "Sometimes mistakes are made." A few passengers nearby glanced up from their phones and newspapers. Rachel felt their eyes on her, measuring her, wondering if she had somehow sneaked her way into a seat she hadn't earned. Heat prickled at her neck, but she held her posture steady, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "I was upgraded," Rachel replied calmly, "by the clerk at the counter. This is the right seat." The attendant's expression hardened. "Well, I'll need you to move back to coach until this is sorted out." There was no mistaking the command in her tone. The words weren't a request but an order, delivered with the kind of finality that made it clear Rachel's presence in that seat was an inconvenience. Murmurs rippled through the rows behind her. Some passengers leaned in, eager for the spectacle, while others shifted uncomfortably, not wanting to be involved. Rachel's stomach knotted, but she didn't lash out. Years of discipline held her steady. She simply nodded once, unclipped her belt, and began gathering her things. As she bent forward, the faint pull of scar tissue in her legs reminded her of the price she had paid to sit in any seat at all. But none of that mattered here, not in this moment. To them, she was just a woman who didn't belong. And as she rose to her feet, the humiliation pressed heavier than the weight of her pack, heavier even than the silence of the men she'd lost. The world she had fought to protect couldn't see past the surface. Not yet. Rachel didn't make a sound as she slid the strap of her bag over her shoulder. The leather was worn smooth from years of travel, the same bag she had carried on deployments and dragged through airports in every corner of the world. She knew what the eyes around her were saying. She had seen that look before, in bars where her uniform had been replaced with civilian clothes. in offices where medals meant nothing next to a tailored suit. It was the look that measured her worth by appearances, not by scars or service. The flight attendant stood stiffly nearby, arms folded, her authority unquestioned in her own mind. Rachel didn't challenge it. She wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing anger, wouldn't let her voice tremble with outrage. Quietly, methodically, she gathered her belongings. Her dignity would leave with her, even if her seat didn't. As she rose, the collar of her t-shirt tugged against her shoulder, sliding just enough to reveal the ink pressed into her skin, the trident. The Navy SEAL insignia that marked her as one of the few, the relentless, the forged-in-fire warriors whose names were whispered with respect. It wasn't flashy, just a stark, precise tattoo etched in black, its edges softened by years in the Sunday. But to anyone who knew what it meant, it was unmistakable. The first gasp came from a woman seated across the aisle. Her eyes widened, her lips parting as if she'd just stumbled onto a secret she wasn't supposed to see. A man a few rows back leaned forward, craning his neck for a better look. Then came the murmurs, low but urgent, like the stirring of a crowd at the start of a storm. "Is that?" someone whispered. "She's a SEAL?" another muttered under their breath. Rachel heard them, but she didn't respond. She let the whispers wash over her, neither confirming nor denying. That had always been her way. In war, you didn't announce who you were, you proved it with every breath, every mission, every sacrifice. And here, in this narrow aisle under fluorescent light, she chose the same silence. Her steps were steady, deliberate, the limp in her right leg just noticeable enough to remind her of the price she had paid. She felt the burn of humiliation in her chest, but she carried it like she had carried rucksacks through mountains, like she had carried fallen brothers across sand. She would not let it crush her. The attendants didn't flinch at the tattoo. They didn't ask, didn't reconsider. They held their professional smiles, the kind that thinly veiled their discomfort. To them, she was just another passenger, one whose presence had disrupted the neat order of their first-class cabin. The murmurs of respect meant nothing if the crew ignored them. Rachel moved down the aisle, her shoulders square, her chin lifted just slightly. She wasn't angry, not in the way the attendants might have expected. No raised voice, no argument to escalate the scene. Only a quiet protest carved into each step, a refusal to let them see her broken. But inside, the frustration cut deep. She thought of teammates who would never board a plane again, of the long nights in desert airfields where she had stood watch while others slept peacefully under the same flag she'd bled for. She thought of how easily people forgot the cost of their comfort. That weight pressed down on her now, heavier than the bag on her shoulder. Still, she walked. Past the curious stares, past the whispers that grew louder with each row. She walked not because she accepted their judgment, but because sometimes silence spoke louder than fury. And though her heart felt heavy with the sting of disrespect, her stride carried the quiet strength of someone who had fought far harder battles than this. She would not let them see her crumble. Not here. Not ever. The metallic click of the cockpit door opening sliced through the low hum of whispers that rippled down the aisle. Rachel didn't turn her head. She kept walking, steady as ever, eyes fixed on the narrow strip of carpet that led her toward coach. But the presence behind her was undeniable. The air shifted, heavy with a sudden pause, as if every pair of eyes on the plane now waited for something to happen. The pilot stepped out, adjusting the brim of his cap as he scanned the cabin. His posture was tall, practiced, the quiet authority of a man used to command. He had intended only to investigate a minor disturbance, the kind that occasionally erupted when passengers tested boundaries. But the moment his eyes landed on Rachel's shoulder, everything else vanished. He froze. The tattoo was exposed just enough to tell the whole story. The trident, the unmistakable emblem of the Navy SEALs. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen that insignia countless times in another life, etched on patches, inked on skin, sewn onto uniforms that had marched beside him through the heat of war. Memories came rushing back in an instant, the whine of rotor blades over hostile terrain, the crackle of radios shouting coordinates, the shadowed figures moving in silence beneath him as he flew cover in the dark. Those missions had depended on SEAL teams, and he knew the courage behind every man and woman who wore that mark. This woman wasn't just another passenger, she was one of them. The flight attendant, oblivious to the change in the air, stepped forward to justify herself. "Captain, there was a mistake with the seating assignment. This passenger doesn't—" "Stop." His voice was sharp, clipped, leaving no room for interpretation. The attendant blinked, startled by the sudden steel in his tone. The pilot's gaze didn't leave Rachel. He studied her, the steady way she carried herself even under humiliation, the set of her jaw, the way she refused to shrink despite the whispers. He knew that posture. He had seen it in briefing rooms, on airstrips, in the faces of those who had walked through fire and returned alive. "What's going on here?" he demanded again, louder this time so the entire cabin could hear. Silence followed. The passengers who had been whispering now sat rigid, waiting. The attendant fumbled for words, trying to explain that Rachel's presence in first class was questionable, that procedures had to be followed. But the more she spoke, the colder the pilot's expression grew. "She has every right to be here," he said finally, his tone flat with certainty. "Every right." Rachel paused in the aisle, torn between defiance and disbelief. For the first time since the confrontation began, she met the pilot's eyes. There was no pity there, no condescension, only recognition. A bond forged in places where survival had been uncertain, where respect was earned, never demanded. The captain stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Rachel and the attendant. His presence alone filled the space, commanding without effort. "This woman," he said firmly, "is a Navy SEAL. I know what that tattoo means, and I know what it costs to wear it. She stays in her seat." Gasps spread through the cabin. A murmur rose, passengers craning their necks to see the woman they had moments ago dismissed. The whispers turned into something else now: respect, awe, even shame. The man who had doubted her fell silent, his phone lowered. Rachel said nothing. She didn't need to. The weight of the pilot's words carried everything she had chosen not to reveal. And in that moment, the cabin belonged not to the authority of uniforms or service tags, but to the unspoken acknowledgement of sacrifice. The flight was silent, waiting for her to decide. The aisle seemed impossibly long as Rachel stood frozen between rows of strangers. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she should keep walking, let the humiliation finish its course, sink back into anonymity where no one would ever know what had just taken place. But then the captain stepped closer, his voice low but carrying the weight of command that silenced every whisper. "Ma'am," he said, his hand gesturing firmly toward the front of the plane, "please return to your seat. First class is where you belong." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order cloaked in respect, the kind that left no room for argument. The crowd parted in stunned, quiet as Rachel hesitated, then slowly turned back. The captain walked beside her, his presence deliberate, his steps steady like a military escort. Each stride echoed with unspoken meaning. She would not walk this path of shame alone. When they reached her seat, he held out a hand, inviting her to sit again. She lowered herself into the leather cushion, this time not as a passenger questioned for her worth, but as someone recognized for what she was. The attendant who had challenged her stood stiffly to the side, her face pale, her confidence stripped away in an instant. The captain didn't let it pass. "You don't ever question someone's value based on appearances," he said sharply, his voice carrying to every corner of the cabin. "This woman has given more for this country than most of us can imagine. She has earned respect, not suspicion." His eyes bored into the crew, leaving no doubt his words were not for her benefit alone, but for the entire airline staff. Remember that the next time you look at a passenger and think you know their story. For a moment, the plane held its breath. Then came the sound of hands clapping, tentative at first, then stronger, rolling through the rows until it filled the cabin like thunder. Some passengers rose to their feet. A man in a business suit dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. A woman clutching a toddler pressed her hand to her heart, tears shining in her eyes. The applause swelled into something more than courtesy. It was gratitude, long overdue, spilling from those who realized they had nearly watched an injustice go unchallenged. Rachel kept her gaze forward, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She didn't smile, didn't wave or acknowledge the chorus of clapping hands. She had never lived for applause, never fought for recognition. The cheers weren't for her, they were for what she represented, for the countless men and women who carried invisible scars and asked for nothing in return. Still, as the noise settled into a reverent hush, she felt something shift deep inside. Her dignity, so quickly stripped away moments before, had been restored. Not by the noise, but by the truth spoken aloud. The flight continued in unusual quiet. People stole glances at her, some with admiration, others with guilt. No one dared question her presence again. And when the plane landed hours later, a few passengers lingered just to thank her softly, their words stumbling but sincere. She accepted them with the same quiet composure she had carried into combat zones. News of what had happened didn't stay contained within the walls of that cabin. A passenger's recount found its way online, and soon the story traveled faster than any aircraft could fly. Strangers across the country read about the woman asked to leave first class, the tattoo that silenced a room, the pilot who stood up when others wouldn't. It spread as both a caution and an inspiration, a reminder that respect cannot be measured in clothes, seats, or appearances. Rachel never sought to become a symbol, but as she walked off the plane that night, she carried with her something more powerful than humiliation or applause. She carried proof that dignity could be defended, that truth could still cut through prejudice, and that even a silent protest could echo far beyond the walls of a single flight.